The grand hall was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, soft laughter, and the occasional clink of fine china. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting sparkling light across the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the smell of rich food and perfume, a mixture that spoke of wealth, taste, and the kind of world where everything was measured in appearances. The guests were an elite crowd, the kind who wore their confidence like a second skin, who judged quickly and expected perfection from everything and everyone around them. In the midst of this world of glittering gowns and tailored suits moved a young waitress. She carried a tray of champagne glasses with careful precision, weaving gracefully between tables without drawing attention to herself. Her uniform was simple, clean, unremarkable. Her hair was tied neatly at the back of her head, and her hands were steady, though her eyes occasionally flicked around the room, noticing the subtle sneers and dismissive glances from the high-profile crowd. She had learned long ago how to move like a shadow in rooms like this, to be present but invisible, to serve without being noticed. Tonight, like many nights before, she worked quietly. She smiled politely, nodded when guests addressed her, and made sure every drink, every plate, every small request was met before anyone even thought to ask twice. It was exhausting, of course, but she had grown used to it. It was work. It was survival. It was the only way she could make sure she could pay the rent, help her family, and keep her life moving forward. Even if it meant she never got to chase her own dreams openly. The night was progressing as usual, when a small commotion began near the stage at the far end of the hall. There was a piano there, black and gleaming under a single spotlight, untouched and largely ignored. It was a grand piano, the kind that could fill a hall like this with music so beautiful it would stop people in their tracks. But tonight, it was just furniture, a silent centerpiece for an event that considered appearances far more important than sound. One of the guests, a man with a loud laugh and a sharper tongue, leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the piano. "Look at that thing," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "All dressed up, sitting there like a statue, waiting for someone brave enough to play it. Or maybe it's just here for decoration. Probably safer that way. Wouldn't want anyone ruining it." The guests around him chuckled, some nervously, some out of sheer politeness. They were used to this kind of behavior, this subtle cruelty that passed for humor in their circles. The young waitress was passing by, carrying a tray with delicate crystal glasses filled with champagne. She paused for just a moment when she heard the laughter. The man's eyes fell on her, as if she were the only one capable of accepting the challenge he was about to issue. He leaned forward and smirked. "Why don't you try it, he said, his tone half mocking, half curious. "Step up to the piano. Show us what you've got. Surely someone in this room has at least a little courage. Or maybe the piano will just stay silent forever." The guests laughed, a light, airy sound that was meant to make the moment even more embarrassing. The waitress froze, the tray of glasses balanced in her hands. She had been invisible her whole life in rooms like this, and suddenly all eyes were on her. Her heart pounded, and she felt the familiar sting of anxiety creeping in. She was no performer here, no trained professional to impress anyone in this elite hall. She was just a girl who served food and poured drinks. That was her world. That was her role. And stepping beyond it had always felt impossible. Yet there was something in the way the man's eyes gleamed, something in the challenge itself that made her pause and think. She remembered a different life, a life that seemed so far away it could have belonged to someone else. A life filled with music, with long hours spent practicing her small fingers across the keys of an old piano at home. A life where her heart beat in rhythm with melodies she alone could hear. A life where sound could express what words never could. Music had been her refuge, her secret, her joy. But life had a way of forcing choices, and hers had led her here. serving the rich and powerful, while her talent stayed hidden behind the walls of her small apartment. A moment passed, and she felt a strange calm wash over her. She set down the tray carefully on a nearby side table, the glasses sparkling in the chandelier light, and walked toward the piano. The sound of her shoes on the marble was faint, but seemed to echo in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, forks paused mid-air, and eyes turned toward her. She was aware of every look, every subtle smirk, every whispered speculation. And yet she continued, step by step, until she reached the piano bench. She sat down slowly, taking in the grand instrument before her. Its black surface reflected the lights above, the polished keys gleaming like a promise, waiting to be fulfilled. Her hands hovered just above the keys, trembling slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of expectation. She could hear the whispers behind her, the amusement, the doubt, the disbelief. "She can't do it," someone muttered. "She's just a waitress. What does she know about music?" The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they carried the assumption that her past, her talent, her effort didn't matter. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The memories came back vividly. The evenings spent at the piano after everyone else had gone to sleep. The long hours learning scales and melodies by ear. The small triumphs when a piece finally came together. The pride in her heart that nobody else could see. She had once dreamed of sharing this with the world, of letting music speak for her, of letting her fingers tell the stories she could never voice. And now, here she was, with a real audience in a hall that judged everything and everyone harshly. She wondered if they were ready for the truth of her talent. Her fingers finally settled on the keys. She touched them lightly, testing the feel, the weight, the sound. A soft note filled the hall, almost shy, almost questioning. The silence that followed was immediate. The laughter that had filled the room faded into something else: curiosity, confusion, a hint of expectation. She tried another note, this time letting it linger, letting it grow. The melody began slowly, cautiously, like a small stream finding its way through rocks. She didn't need to look at the crowd. She could feel them, sense their disbelief, their judgment, their anticipation. The man who had challenged her leaned forward, clearly surprised at the sound, but trying not to show it. Some guests whispered among themselves, unsure if what they were hearing was real. The soft piano notes floated through the air, delicate but confident, tentative but commanding. She could feel a shift happening. The room, once alive with polite chatter and quiet mockery, had grown still. Even the waiters in the back seemed to pause, as if drawn toward the music, unable to look away. And then something remarkable happened. She found herself lost in the music, her fingers moving with a memory and precision that seemed to take on a life of its own. Each note carried emotion, joy, sorrow, hope, and longing all mixed together. It was not just music. It was a story, her story, told without words. Her body relaxed, her breathing slowed, and the nervous tension that had gripped her earlier melted into something else entirely: confidence, freedom, and a quiet thrill that reminded her why she had loved music in the first place. The crowd could no longer ignore her. Eyes widened, mouths opened slightly in awe, some hands clasped unconsciously as they listened. They were hearing something genuine, something powerful, something they had not expected from a young woman in a simple uniform. She could feel their attention, their disbelief, the sudden realization that they had underestimated her completely. Each note was a small victory, a quiet proof that talent could not be hidden forever, that passion could not be contained by circumstance. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours to her. Every chord, every trill, every careful movement of her fingers was precise yet full of feeling. She played with everything she had, and for the first time in a long time, she was not just serving a crowd. She was commanding it. She was no longer the invisible waitress who moved quietly among tables. She was the person she had always been inside, the one who spoke through music, who shared stories without uttering a single word. By the time she reached the final notes of her opening piece, the room was completely silent, holding its breath as if afraid to interrupt what they had just witnessed. And when the last key was pressed, there was a moment of stillness, a pause so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the true reaction of the elite crowd. Faces were no longer dismissive. Some were wide-eyed in shock. Others wore expressions that were almost reverent, as if they had glimpsed something rare, something valuable, something they had never expected to see in someone they had assumed was ordinary. The man who had challenged her shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had laughed, mocked, and expected ridicule, but what he had seen instead was extraordinary. He avoided her eyes, unsure how to respond. He had underestimated her completely. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of ridicule. They were of astonishment, admiration, and disbelief. People leaned forward, wanting to see more, to understand how someone who seemed so ordinary could produce. As the last note of her first melody faded into the grand hall, the young waitress closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her racing heart. The applause had not yet begun, and the silence that hung in the air was heavier than she had expected. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was charged, electric, the kind that made her feel every heartbeat in her chest. She realized she was no longer just performing. She was standing on a bridge between her past and the present, between the life she had been forced to live and the one she had always dreamed of. Memories, sudden and vivid, rushed back to her as she sat there, fingers resting lightly on the piano keys. She could see herself at 8 years old, sitting on a warm wooden bench in a small apartment that smelled faintly of old books and the lingering scent of her mother's cooking. The piano there was older than her, keys chipped and faded, but it had been her whole world. She remembered how the first note she ever struck had sounded off, harsh and clumsy, yet it had filled her with a strange joy she had never felt before. From that moment, she had known she wanted to speak through music. It was the language that felt truest to her, the language that could express everything she could not say in words. Her father had been gone long before she could remember, and her mother worked 2 jobs to keep their small home together. Money had always been tight, and dreams like hers had to take a back seat to survival. She remembered the nights she would stay up late, hiding behind the piano, practicing quietly so she would not disturb her mother's sleep. She had no formal lessons, no expensive instructors, nothing but determination and an old, battered piano that her neighbors had passed down to her family when it was no longer wanted. She learned by ear, by trial and error, by sheer stubbornness. Every wrong note, every mistake had been a lesson. Every melody she mastered had been a victory. Her mother had often watched her with a mixture of pride and worry. "You have a gift," she would say softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "But the world isn't kind to people who chase dreams that don't pay the bills. Be careful, love. Be careful with your heart." The words had stayed with her all her life, and she had understood them. That was why, despite the fire inside her, she had taken the first job she could find, carrying trays and serving food, shelving her music until later, always later. But even when she was busy with work, the music never left her. It was a constant hum beneath her daily life, a quiet companion that reminded her of who she truly was. The hall around her now, filled with glittering guests and crystal chandeliers, seemed miles away from that small apartment, from the piano she had learned to love. Yet as she sat on the bench and felt the smooth keys beneath her fingers, the memories and the music merged. Her hands moved almost instinctively, guided by years of muscle memory and emotion that had been stored deep inside her. She did not need to think about the next note. It was already part of her, waiting to come alive. The room had begun to stir again. Whispers floated through the air, low and curious, tinged with disbelief. How can she play like that? One guest murmured. She's just a waitress. There's no way she has real training. Another voice, slightly more cautious, said, I've never heard anything like it. Those chords? The way she moves through them. It's almost effortless. She could hear the subtle awe, the faint acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening right in front of them. And yet, she did not let herself get distracted. Her focus was on the music, on the story she was telling through her fingers, and on the years of quiet practice that had brought her to this moment. She began to play another piece, one that she had written for herself years ago, a composition full of both longing and hope. It was a piece she had never shared with anyone outside her small apartment. It was private, personal, a reflection of the struggles and dreams she had carried alone. As the first notes rang out, she could feel the hall shift. The guests leaned forward, unconsciously drawn toward the sound. Some held their breath, some closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried away by the music. Even the staff in the back stopped moving, watching from a distance, unable to tear themselves away. The waitress lost herself in the melody, each chord a word, each passage a sentence. She remembered nights spent imagining audiences like this, nights spent dreaming of performing for people who would understand and appreciate the depth of what she could create. Yet now, here she was, not in a concert hall or a recital room, but in a place that had laughed at the idea of her talent just moments ago. And yet the piano beneath her fingers transformed the space. The laughter and doubt faded, replaced by the purity of sound and the honesty of her expression. Her mind wandered briefly to her mother, wondering what she would think if she could see this moment. Would she be proud, she wondered? Would she recognize the girl she had nurtured, the child who had spent countless nights practicing by the dim light of a small lamp? The thought made her fingers dance across the keys with more energy, more emotion. Each note was a tribute to the sacrifices that had been made for her, to the struggles that had shaped her, and to the quiet determination that had kept her moving forward even when the two worlds seemed indifferent. The applause finally began. Soft at first, hesitant, then growing louder as the piece progressed. But she did not stop. She could feel the momentum building, the energy of the room feeding into her performance. Her fingers flew over the keys, executing intricate passages that she had spent years perfecting, but doing so with a lightness that made it look effortless. Every mistake that could have haunted her, every insecurity that had ever held her back, seemed to vanish in the music. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, a force that could command attention without saying a single word. The faces in the audience were a mix of astonishment and admiration. Some could not believe their eyes or ears. A few of the older guests leaned back in their chairs, nodding slightly, as if recognizing a rare talent that deserved respect. Others whispered to each other, trying to figure out how someone so young and seemingly ordinary could possess such skill. The man who had challenged her earlier sat rigid in his seat, his smug expression replaced by a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps shame, perhaps awe. He had expected humiliation, not mastery. She transitioned into a section of the piece that was particularly challenging, a part that required both technical skill and emotional depth. Her hands moved quickly, yet gracefully, over the keys. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. She could feel the music flowing through her, an extension of her own emotions, her own story. The room seemed to hold its breath, caught in the current of sound. The chandelier lights shimmered above, and for a moment It felt as if the entire hall existed only for the music, only for her expression of it. As she played, flashes of her past continued to surface. She remembered the faces of neighbors who had watched her practice, the small smiles of encouragement from strangers who appreciated music, the times she had played in empty rooms just to hear herself, just to feel the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. She thought about the nights she had cried over difficult passages, frustrated by her own limitations, and the nights she had laughed in triumph when a difficult piece finally came together. All of those experiences converged in this moment, fueling her performance with a depth and authenticity that could not be faked. The audience was no longer just listening. They were experiencing. They leaned forward, some clasping their hands together, some pressing them to their hearts. A few were teary-eyed, though they tried to hide it. The music had broken through their pretenses, their carefully constructed barriers of sophistication and superiority. They had expected entertainment, perhaps a novelty, perhaps even a minor joke. Instead, they were witnessing something real, something profound, something that could not be ignored. That the waitress could feel the shift in the energy around her. The room had changed. The elite guests who had barely given her a glance now gave her their full attention. The music she had thought of as private, personal, and unshared had become a bridge between her world and theirs. It was not about impressing them. It was about being true to herself, about letting the years of practice and passion speak louder than words ever could. She realized that for the first time in a long time, she was performing not for survival, not for recognition, but for the pure joy of expressing herself. The final notes approached, slow, deliberate, and full of emotion. She allowed herself a brief smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had brought her here. Each chord was a culmination of years of practice, sacrifice, and resilience. She felt the music resonate in the hall, in the people around her, and in herself. It was a moment of triumph, a small victory over the years of doubt and obscurity that had clouded her life. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the hall remained silent for a heartbeat, longer than expected. Then a ripple of applause began, soft at first, hesitant, then swelling into a wave of appreciation and admiration. Some guests clapped loudly, some whispered words of praise, and some simply nodded, unable to find words that could match what they had just experienced. Even the man who had mocked her earlier stood, slowly, uncertainly, joining in the applause. The applause still echoed softly through the grand hall, but the young waitress barely noticed. She returned to the piano bench, her fingers brushing the polished keys as if greeting old friends. The confidence that had begun to blossom in part two now anchored her, steady and quiet, like the deep current of a river that carries everything along effortlessly. She had tasted the awe of the audience, felt the shift in the room, and it ignited something deep inside her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to play not carefully, not timidly, but freely. She began again, this time with a piece she had never attempted in front of anyone, a composition that challenged even her own skills. Her hands moved faster now, sure of their place on the keys, dancing across black and white in perfect harmony. Each note rang out, clear and true, resonating through the high ceilings of the hall. The music was no longer merely an echo of her past. It was a living, breathing thing, filling the space with energy and emotion. The guests leaned forward, caught completely by surprise. The first chords alone had been enough to hush whispers and laughter, but now, as the melody deepened, their skepticism melted into fascination. Eyes widened, mouths fell slightly open, and hands that had been folded politely on laps began to shift, some tapping fingers nervously, some gripping the edge of chairs. The music was demanding their attention, their respect, and it was doing so without a word, without explanation, without needing permission. Her mind drifted slightly as she played. not in distraction, but in immersion. She remembered the countless hours she had spent alone, practicing in her tiny apartment, her small hands bruised and aching from repetition, her heart full of hope and longing. She had dreamed of this moment, had imagined herself standing in front of strangers, letting her music speak louder than her words, letting the world understand who she really was. And now, here she was. The piano beneath her fingers was no longer just wood and strings. It was a voice, a storyteller, a bridge between the life she had been living and the life she had been yearning for. She could see the subtle changes in the audience. The man who had mocked her moments ago had straightened in his chair, his jaw tight, eyes glued to her hands as they flew over the keys. He had expected failure, expected amusement, expected an easy joke. Instead, he saw mastery, grace, and a courage that startled him. Around the room, others whispered in disbelief. "How can she do that?" One woman asked, her voice trembling with amazement. "I've never seen anything like it," another murmured. Every word, every reaction confirmed what she already felt deep inside. She was no longer invisible. She had become the center of the hall, not because she demanded it, but because the music commanded it. The piece she played was complex, full of rapid passages, unexpected shifts in tempo, and delicate harmonies that required not only skill but intuition. Her fingers moved instinctively, guided by memory, emotion, and a deep understanding of sound that went beyond technique. Each note was deliberate, yet natural, flowing effortlessly into the next. She could feel the rhythm of the room syncing with her own, the audience's attention wrapping around every phrase she played. Some closed their eyes, letting the music take them somewhere far beyond the walls of the hall. Others leaned closer, straining to catch every nuance, every subtle shift in tone. She began to vary the dynamics of the piece, sometimes soft and delicate, barely brushing the keys, other times powerful and commanding, filling every corner of the hall with resonance. The contrast drew the audience deeper, capturing their imagination, pulling them into a story that was both universal and intensely personal. They could feel the emotions in the music, the joy, the sorrow, the hope, the longing, without needing to understand why. Her performance had become a language, one that transcended social status, wealth, and expectation. A few moments into this new section, she allowed herself to smile, a small, almost shy curve of the lips. The music had become playful, teasing the audience just as she had played as a child, imagining friends listening and cheering her on. The sound of her fingers moving so quickly, it precisely filled the hall like a living thing. Even the staff in the background, who had been frozen in quiet admiration, found themselves leaning forward, unable to look away. The music was not just entertainment, it was revelation. Revelation of a talent that had remained hidden too long. She noticed a few of the older guests exchanging glances. Some nodded slowly, recognizing the depth and sophistication of her skill. One of them, a retired musician, leaned toward his companion, whispering, "She's trained?" "Trained or not, she has the soul of a virtuoso. Look at her phrasing, the control, the emotion. This is not a child playing for fun. This is an artist." These words were private, yet she could feel the energy of their acknowledgement radiating through the hall, adding to her own growing confidence. The music took on a more dramatic tone as she approached the climax of the piece. Her fingers flew over the keys with speed and precision, but there was no sense of panic or effort. It was controlled chaos, beauty in motion. The audience sat captivated, some holding their breath, others leaning so far forward it seemed they might topple out of their chairs. They were witnessing not only technical skill, but emotional honesty, a performance that revealed vulnerability, courage, and artistry all at once. The contrast between her humble appearance and the brilliance of her playing added to the intensity of the moment. They had assumed she was ordinary, invisible, replaceable. Now every expectation had been shattered. The man who had dared to challenge her watched with a mixture of disbelief and humility. He had mocked her without thought, confident in his superiority. Now he sat quietly, unsure how to respond, caught off guard by the undeniable truth before him. The music spoke more loudly than any words he could muster. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that talent and dedication could exist anywhere, and that judging someone by their role or appearance was a foolish, short-sighted thing to do. As she reached the final section of the piece, she allowed herself to pour every ounce of feeling into her playing. Her childhood memories, the struggles, the long nights, the sacrifices, all of it flowed through her fingers, and the hall felt as if it were breathing with her. The audience could feel it too, the authenticity, the honesty, the raw human emotion that made the performance unforgettable. Some were moved to tears, though they tried to hide it behind polite expressions. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how someone so young, so ordinary in appearance, could produce something so extraordinary. The climax of the piece was a whirlwind of notes, fast and intricate, yet every chord landed perfectly. Every passage resonated with clarity and intention. It was the kind of music that could be recorded, studied, admired, and still leave listeners in awe. The audience was completely absorbed. No one spoke, no one moved unnecessarily. All attention focused on the young woman at the piano, the hands that danced across the keys, the music that filled every corner of the room with life. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the piece slowed. The final chords were deliberate, resonant, lingering in the air long after her fingers had lifted from the keys. The hall was silent again, a silence charged with astonishment and awe. The young waitress sat back slightly, her chest heaving, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the energy of giving everything she had to the music. She looked at the audience, saw the stunned faces, the wide eyes, the whispered admiration. She felt a strange mix of humility and pride. She had shared herself, fully, honestly, and the world had responded. The applause began tentatively at first, a ripple of hands clapping, but it quickly grew into a wave of appreciation that filled the hall. People rose to their feet, some uncertainly, some with exuberance, but all acknowledging the power of what they had just witnessed. A man who had mocked her moments before now stood, uncertainly joining the applause, his eyes lowered in acknowledgment of her talent. Other guests approached, whispering to each other, exchanging glances that spoke of astonishment, respect, and a dawning understanding that appearances could be deceiving. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile as the audience's admiration washed over her. She had taken a risk, stepped beyond the boundaries that life had imposed, and revealed her true self. The music had carried her, protected her, and elevated her in a way that words never could. She realized that for the first time in years, she was not just surviving. She was thriving, expressing herself fully, and claiming a moment that belonged entirely to her. As she rose from the piano bench, the audience continued to applaud. Some guests whispered their amazement. Others simply stared, unable to believe what they had seen and heard. She could feel the energy of the hall, the warmth, the respect, the sheer astonishment radiating toward her. It was more than validation. It was acknowledgement, a recognition of her years of practice, her talent, her courage, and her heart. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way that had never happened before. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what this could mean. Perhaps doors that had been closed would now open. Perhaps opportunities long denied would finally present themselves. Perhaps, finally, her music could find the place in the world it had always deserved. But even more than that, she felt a deep satisfaction, a quiet joy, that The grand hall had grown quiet once again, but this time the silence was different. It was not the tentative pause that had followed her first piece. It was alive with expectation, almost a tangible force, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The young waitress sat at the piano, her hands hovering lightly above the keys, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Every glance from the audience, every whispered comment, every subtle shift in posture told her one thing. They wanted more. They were captivated. They were mesmerized. They were ready to witness something extraordinary. She drew in a deep breath and began again. The first notes were soft, gentle, almost teasing in their simplicity. She allowed the melody to build slowly, weaving through minor chords and gentle harmonies, letting the audience sink into the music before revealing the true depth of what she could do. Her fingers moved with precision and confidence, guided by years of practice and an intuitive understanding of the piano. Each note was deliberate, each chord deliberate, yet effortless. She could feel the room responding, the energy shifting subtly as the music reached every corner. The guests leaned forward, unable to resist the pull of the melody. The man who had mocked her earlier sat rigid, hands gripping the edge of his chair, his eyes fixed on her fingers. He could no longer dismiss what he was seeing. The technical skill, the emotion, the timing, it was undeniable. Around the hall, conversations had ceased entirely. Even the waitstaff paused in their work, mesmerized by the sound that seemed to make the chandeliers shimmer a little brighter, the marble floors reflect more light, the air itself hum with energy. The music was no longer just hers. It had become the language of the room, speaking to every person present, bypassing doubt, arrogance, and expectation. As the piece grew, she allowed herself to explore more intricate passages, moving from soft, gentle tones to cascading arpeggios that rang out like water over stones. Each hand worked independently, yet together they created harmony that was both complex and beautiful. Her audience gasped quietly at the speed, the clarity, and the emotion. The music was playful at times, daring at others, then soft again, almost vulnerable, like a whispered secret meant only for those who were willing to listen. She could feel the awe, the disbelief, the astonishment radiating toward her, but she did not let it distract her. Every note, every phrase, every pause was intentional. Her mind drifted briefly to her childhood, to the tiny apartment where she had first fallen in love with the piano. She remembered the nights she had played alone, pretending the walls of her home were a grand hall, imagining an audience of friends and strangers alike who could hear her heart through her fingers. She had dreamed of this, of sharing her music, of touching people with something real and beautiful. And now, here she was, in a real grand hall, in front of real people who had doubted her mere existence, playing not for them, not for recognition, but for herself, for the music that had carried her through every hardship. The melody took on a new intensity. She shifted into a section that demanded not only technical skill, but emotional vulnerability. The notes were sharp, clear, urgent, almost pleading. She could feel her own emotions rising, the tension of years spent hidden, ignored, and underestimated pressing against her chest. She let it pour into her hands, guiding them to create something that was not just sound but confession, not just music but story. Every person in the room felt it. They leaned closer, some holding their breath, some gripping their seats, unable to tear their eyes away from the young woman who was transforming the hall with nothing but her talent and heart. Some of the elite guests exchanged glances, whispering quietly, disbelief written across their faces. "Is this real?" One woman murmured, "She's not just good. She's incredible. Look at her hands, look at the way she feels every note." Another guest nodded slowly, eyes wide. I've heard professional pianists perform in halls like this, and I have never seen anything like her control, her expression, her presence. Their astonishment was genuine, their admiration uncontaminated by pretense. The music had broken down their walls, shattered their assumptions, and forced them to acknowledge a truth they could not ignore. The man who had mocked her earlier now sat in silence, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced by humility. He had thought this would be a moment of ridicule, a brief distraction to amuse himself and his peers. Instead, he was witnessing raw, undeniable talent, a performance that demanded respect and left no room for mockery. He could feel a strange mix of regret and awe. He had underestimated her, as had everyone else in the room. And he realized, perhaps too late to save his pride, that talent cannot be judged by appearances, by occupation, by social standing. The young waitress did not stop. She allowed the music to grow louder, faster, more complex. Her fingers flew across the keys in a whirlwind of precision, each movement perfectly calculated, yet full of life and energy. The notes seemed to leap from the piano, filling the room with sound so rich and full that it almost vibrated in the air. The chandeliers glittered, the walls reflected, the floors echoed, and every ear in the room was captivated. She was no longer just performing. She was creating an atmosphere, an experience that would remain in the memory of everyone present long after the final note faded. She shifted seamlessly into a part of the composition that was particularly challenging. Rapid scales, intricate fingerwork, and complex harmonies tested her skill, but she moved through them effortlessly. Years of practice, moments of frustration, hours of quiet determination, all of it came together in her hands. She felt a thrill, a surge of energy that was almost physical, as if the piano itself recognized her dedication and responded with its full voice. The audience was spellbound. Some gasped softly at the speed of her playing, others leaned forward, faces illuminated with awe and disbelief. The piece became more expressive, filled with contrasts that captured both her strength and vulnerability. Soft passages seemed to caress the room, delicate and tender, almost whispering secrets, while loud, powerful chords demanded attention, asserting authority and control. The audience felt every shift, every nuance, every emotion. They were no longer passive observers. They were part of the music, carried along by the skill, the heart, and the soul of the young woman at the piano. She remembered the nights she had spent practicing in solitude, imagining people listening, imagining the joy of sharing something beautiful. She had played for no one but herself, and now the music was finally being heard, truly heard, by people who could appreciate not just her skill, but her story, her dedication, her courage. And yet, she played for herself first, letting the notes flow naturally, letting her heart guide her fingers. The applause, the admiration, the astonishment, those were consequences, not goals. The climax of the piece approached, a section that demanded the absolute best of her technique and her emotional presence. Her hands flew over the keys with precision, creating sound that was intricate, fast, yet perfectly harmonious. The audience watched in rapt attention, some holding their breath, some closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them completely. The room seemed to pulse with energy, each note resonating in the heart of everyone present. The contrast between the humble appearance of the pianist and the brilliance of the music made the moment even more extraordinary. They had expected an ordinary performance. They were witnessing a revelation. The man who had mocked her earlier now sat quietly, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on her hands as they danced across the keys. His smugness had vanished completely. He had underestimated her, as had so many others. And as he watched, he felt a strange mix of admiration and humility. The young woman before him was not just talented, she was extraordinary. He realized, with a quiet sting of regret, that he had never truly seen her before. He had only seen what he assumed. The music was forcing him, and everyone else, to reconsider everything. The young waitress could feel the energy in the room building. The audience was leaning closer, completely absorbed, as she moved into the final passages of her performance. Rapid sequences, sudden pauses, delicate trills, and powerful chords all came together in a crescendo that filled the hall with sound and emotion. Every note was deliberate, every movement intentional, yet it felt effortless. She was no longer conscious of herself. She was simply the music, and the music was her. The audience felt it too, caught in the tide of sound, carried along by the skill, the passion, and the humanity that shone through every note dot, and then, just as suddenly as it had grown, the music softened. She allowed the final chords to linger, gentle and resonant, filling the air with a sense of completion, of satisfaction, of awe. The room was silent for a heartbeat, then another, as if the world itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. She lifted her hands from the keys, heart racing, chest heaving, and opened her eyes. The audience was watching her, completely transformed from doubt and amusement to admiration and wonder. Faces glowed with astonishment, some teary-eyed, some wide-eyed, all deeply moved by what they had witnessed. The applause began softly, then swelled into a wave that filled the hall with sound. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some whispering their amazement to each other. The man who had Mo. The young waitress slowly rose from the piano bench, still catching her breath from the intensity of her performance. The applause that had erupted earlier had grown into a sustained ovation, echoing through the hall like waves of sound that seemed to wash over every guest, reaching even the corners that had once felt detached from the spectacle. She had not expected this. She had imagined polite claps, perhaps some faint acknowledgement, maybe a few murmurs of surprise. But this was something entirely different. The hall was alive with admiration, awe, and disbelief, and she could feel it pressing toward her, a force she had never encountered before. As she stepped back from the piano, the realization hit her slowly. She had changed the room. The same people who had laughed at her moments ago, who had whispered doubts about her place in this world, were now watching her with genuine respect. Their expressions were open, curious, some even vulnerable in their amazement. It was not just admiration for her skill. It was acknowledgement of her courage, of the vulnerability it took to stand before them and share her talent so openly. In that moment, she felt a connection with each of them, however brief, as if the music had built invisible bridges across social class, appearances, and assumptions. Guests began approaching the piano with caution and awe, some wanting to speak, others simply wanting to witness more closely the source of the music that had held them captive. A few tried to hide their astonishment behind polite gestures, but the intensity of what they had experienced was impossible to contain. Whispers of admiration filled the air, soft but insistent, growing louder as more people began to realize the rarity of what they had just witnessed. "She's remarkable," one guest whispered. "I've never seen anything like this. Truly extraordinary." Another nodded, her eyes wide, glancing around to ensure someone else had heard the same truth she did. "It's not just skill, it's presence. She commands the room." The man who had mocked her earlier remained near his seat, still recovering from the shock. His usual arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility, and there was a tension in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement that he had been entirely wrong. He watched her as she straightened her uniform, brushing her hair back gently, and for the first time in his life, he felt the sting of underestimating someone so completely. He had expected a performance that would amuse him, a momentary joke at the expense of someone he considered insignificant. Instead, he had witnessed artistry, courage, and heart. all embodied in one young woman who had dared to defy expectation. Meanwhile, other guests continued to react, some with open admiration, some in quiet awe, some with teary eyes as they realized the depth of her performance. Even the staff, who had been silently watching from the edges of the room, could not help but express their pride. The kitchen staff peeked around the corners, whispering excitedly to one another. "Did you see that?" One said, unable to hide a wide smile. "I can't believe she's the same girl who's been serving us drinks all night. She's incredible." Their reactions were genuine, heartfelt, a mirror of what the audience outside their world was experiencing on a more intimate scale. The young waitress felt a mixture of pride and humility as she stood there, absorbing the energy around her. She had given everything she had in that performance, poured her soul into every note, and now she could feel the ripple effect it had caused. It was more than just recognition. It was transformation. She had shifted the perception of those around her, challenging assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of. For the first time, she realized that her talent was no longer invisible. She could not be dismissed. She could not be overlooked. Some guests approached her, speaking softly, their voices laced with admiration and curiosity. One older woman, who had been seated near the front, reached out gently. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Have you been trained professionally? This is remarkable." The young waitress shook her head, smiling faintly. "No," she replied quietly. "I learned on my own. I've been playing since I was very young. Music has always been my escape, my voice." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's extraordinary. You have a gift that should never be hidden." Another guest, a man with an air of authority, approached more cautiously. "I've seen many musicians in my life," he said, his tone respectful, "and few have ever captured me like that. You have presence. You command the room. That is rare, very rare." The young waitress's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the compliment, not from pride, but from the overwhelming realization that her passion, her practice, her quiet dedication had finally been recognized. She had spent so long believing that her music existed only in private spaces, only for herself. Now it was being acknowledged by people who had the power to change her life. Meanwhile, conversations spread like wildfire through the crowd. Guests whispered to each other, sharing their astonishment and admiration. "Did you hear how she transitioned between sections?" one asked, barely able to contain excitement. "And the emotion in her phrasing. She wasn't just playing. She was telling a story." Another nodded eagerly. "Exactly. It was as if every note carried meaning beyond the music itself." "She's remarkable." The energy in the room had shifted completely. Where once there had been skepticism and amusement, now there was awe and respect. She had not only performed, she had transformed the atmosphere, leaving everyone profoundly affected. As the applause continued, she noticed the subtle gestures of recognition from the staff around her. Servers, kitchen workers, and even cleaners who had moved silently in the background exchanged looks of pride and admiration. They had known her before anyone else had noticed. They had seen her quiet dedication, her long hours, her discipline, and now the world was finally seeing it too. It was a shared victory, a validation not only of her talent, but of the resilience and perseverance that had brought her to this moment. The man who had challenged her now approached, cautiously and quietly. He extended a hand, his face still tinged with humility. I owe you an apology," he said, voice low. "I underestimated you. You are extraordinary." She accepted the handshake with a quiet nod, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you," she replied simply. There was no bitterness, no judgment in her tone, only grace. She had risen above the mockery, and in that moment, she felt a freedom that she had never known. The acknowledgement of her talent, even from someone who had doubted her, was a powerful affirmation that other guests began to approach. Some asking where she had trained, some inquiring about her experience, and some simply expressing their astonishment. The questions were endless, but she answered each one with humility and honesty. "I've been playing since I was a child," she explained. "I didn't have formal training. I've just practiced every day, learned by ear, and loved every moment I could spend with the piano." Their reactions were a mix of admiration and disbelief. They could not comprehend that such extraordinary skill had developed outside the confines of formal institutions, outside the expectations of privilege. The atmosphere in the hall had transformed completely. Guests who had once whispered judgments were now openly celebrating her achievement. Conversation centered on her talent, her courage, and the emotion she had conveyed through her performance. Even those who had initially doubted her now spoke of her with respect and admiration. It was as if the music had rewritten the rules of the room, shifting the focus from appearances to substance. From mockery to recognition. The young waitress felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of pride, relief, and exhilaration. She had taken a risk, stepped beyond the boundaries of her world, and shared her gift openly. The consequences had been far greater than she could have imagined. She realized that this moment was not only a turning point for her, but also a lesson for those who had underestimated her. She had proven that talent, dedication, and heart cannot be hidden forever, and that courage can transform even the most skeptical audience. Among the crowd, one guest lingered with particular interest. A well-known patron of the arts, someone whose opinion carried weight and influence, had been watching quietly, absorbing every detail of her performance. Unlike others who had reacted immediately, he had observed, waiting to see if the moment would pass or if the talent was genuine. Now, after witnessing her mastery and the emotion she had conveyed, he approached with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. His presence radiated authority, yet there was an undeniable warmth in his eyes as he spoke. "You have a gift," he said softly. "A rare and powerful gift, one that should never be hidden. Have you ever considered performing for a wider audience?" The young waitress shook her head. I've always loved music," she replied quietly. "But life has been complicated. I've had to focus on work, on supporting my family. I never thought my music would reach anyone beyond the small apartment where I practiced." The patron smiled gently. "Talent like yours cannot remain hidden forever. I would like to help you, to give you opportunities you deserve. Will you allow me to do that?" Her heart raced, and for a moment words failed her. She nodded slowly, a mixture of disbelief and hope washing over her. This was the moment she had dreamed of in secret for years, the chance to share her music, to be recognized, to take the first. The young waitress walked through the grand hall once more, her heart still buzzing from the night's events. The applause, the astonished faces, the whispers of admiration, they lingered in her mind, replaying like a melody she could not forget. She had stepped into a room full of the elite, people who had once assumed she was ordinary, and she had revealed a part of herself that few had ever seen. Now the world felt different. Even the air seemed charged with possibility, and she could sense that her life was no longer confined to the narrow lines she had once drawn around herself. As she moved between the tables, greeting guests and quietly returning to her duties, she noticed how differently they looked at her. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a slight nod of recognition, a faint smile, but it was unmistakable. They were seeing her not just as a waitress, but as someone extraordinary, someone whose talent had the power to leave a lasting impression. A few approached her with more direct admiration, their voices soft but sincere. "You were incredible tonight," one said. I've never heard anything like that. Have you ever considered performing professionally? She shook her head, smiling gently. I never thought it would be possible, she admitted. I've always loved music, but life didn't leave much room for it. The memory of her childhood returned vividly. She remembered the cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, the small piano that had been her first teacher, and the nights she had practiced in secret while the rest of the world slept. Music had been her escape, her comfort, her companion when life felt too heavy. She had never imagined that the melodies she had poured so much of herself into would someday reach such a grand audience, or that people would respond with awe and respect. And now, here she was, seeing her dreams reflected in the faces of those who had doubted her mere existence. Word of her performance had spread quickly through the hall. Even those who had not witnessed the initial moments approached with curiosity, eager to understand what had captivated everyone else. She was met with a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and excitement. People asked questions, shared their amazement, and expressed a desire to hear more. Each interaction reminded her of the significance of what she had accomplished. She had taken a risk by stepping up to the piano, and it had transformed not only the perception of those around her, but her own perception of herself. Among the guests, one figure stood out. A well-known patron of the arts, someone respected and influential, had been observing quietly from a distance. He approached her with deliberate steps, his eyes reflecting both curiosity and admiration. I have been watching you, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of authority. You have a talent that cannot be ignored, a gift that deserves a wider audience. Have you ever thought about sharing your music beyond tonight? She felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of hope, excitement, and disbelief. She shook her head, unable to find the words immediately. I've always dreamed of it, she admitted. But life has always had other plans. The patron smiled gently. Talent like yours should never remain hidden. I would like to help you, if you will allow me. Opportunities await, ones that can bring your music to the world. Will you let me assist you in taking this next step? Her heart raced, and for a moment, the weight of disbelief held her tongue. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Slowly, she nodded, a small, tentative movement that carried the promise of something new. For the first time, she believed that her music could take her beyond the walls of the hall, beyond the life she had known, into a future she had long imagined. The room seemed to hum with anticipation. Guests who had witnessed her performance exchanged glances, smiles, and whispered affirmations. Some approached her to offer congratulations. Others simply nodded, their expressions filled with admiration and respect. The energy of the hall had shifted completely. Where there had once been skepticism and doubt, there was now recognition and possibility. The young waitress felt the profound impact of the moment, realizing that she had not only revealed her talent, but had also altered the perceptions of those around her in a way that would not soon be forgotten. She remembered the long years of quiet practice, the sacrifices she had made, and the moments of frustration that had seemed endless at the time. Every wrong note, every failed attempt, every evening spent alone at the piano had led to this moment. She realized that the journey had not only shaped her skills, but had also built the resilience and courage necessary to face an audience that could have dismissed her. And yet she had played anyway, trusting her instincts, trusting her heart. And now she was being rewarded in ways she had never dared to imagine. The patron of the arts spoke again, his tone soft but insistent. You have a story as well as talent. People will want to hear it, see it, feel it. Music has the power to connect, to inspire, to change lives. You can do that. Will you take the step? She looked around at the audience, at the faces of people who had been transformed by her music. at the subtle pride of her colleagues in the back, at the respect and curiosity in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. And in that moment, she realized that she could. She could step into a new world, one where her music was not hidden, where her talent could reach beyond the walls of this hall, touching lives in ways she had only dreamed of. A few of the guests lingered close, speaking softly among themselves. "She's remarkable," one said, "and humble. That combination. It's rare. Very rare." Another nodded. "I can't believe she's been unnoticed for so long. She deserves recognition, opportunities, respect. She's extraordinary." Their words felt like validation, not just for her skill, but for every moment she had persevered in silence, for every hour she had spent practicing alone, for every small victory she had celebrated in private. She had been invisible, underestimated, dismissed, and yet here she stood, undeniable in her brilliance. The young waitress felt a warmth in her chest, a deep and profound sense of satisfaction. She had done what she had set out to do. She had played from the heart, shared her music openly, and touched people in ways that words alone could not. She realized that the applause, the admiration, and the recognition were not the goal. They were consequences of her honesty, her dedication, and her courage. The real triumph was in the act itself, in trusting herself, trusting her talent, and allowing the world to see her as she truly was. Among the guests, a few who had initially been skeptical approached her more directly. "I have to admit," one said, "I did not expect what I saw tonight. I thought this would be a novelty, a small moment of amusement. Instead, I witnessed artistry, depth, emotion, and mastery. You have something extraordinary. Never hide it again." The young waitress smiled softly, feeling the weight of their acknowledgement, the affirmation of her path, the validation of years of effort and sacrifice. She had been invisible for too long, and now she was not only seen, she was recognized. The man who had mocked her earlier lingered nearby, still quiet, still processing. His eyes reflected a new understanding, a humility he had not known before. He had learned a lesson in judgment, in assumption, in underestimating someone based on appearance or role. He approached her hesitantly, voice low and respectful. "You have talent beyond measure," he said. I see that now. I underestimated you, and I apologize. You deserve every recognition, every opportunity that comes your way." She nodded graciously. "Thank you," she replied simply. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only acknowledgement, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing her worth. The evening continued, and the young waitress found herself at the center of attention, not because she sought it, but because her talent demanded it. Guests asked questions, expressed admiration, and spoke of opportunities that could take her music far beyond this hall. She listened, absorbing every word, weighing every possibility, and feeling a sense of purpose she had never known. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future shaped not by necessity, but by passion, by talent, by the courage to step forward and claim what was rightfully hers. Later, when the hall had quieted and the guests had slowly begun to leave, she lingered near the piano. She ran her fingers lightly across the keys, feeling the familiar texture, the subtle resistance, the resonance of sound that had been her companion for so long. She remembered the small apartment where it had all begun, the hours of practice, the nights of longing, the moments of frustration and triumph. And she realized that everything, the struggles, the sacrifices, the quiet persistence, had led to this moment of recognition, this affirmation of her talent, this glimpse of a future she had long dreamed of. The patron of the arts approached once more, offering a quiet smile. "Tonight was only the beginning," he said. "There is a world waiting to hear your music. Are you ready?" She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm determination settle over her. She nodded slowly, a small but resolute gesture. "Yes," she replied. "I'm ready." The words felt heavy with promise, with hope, with the culmination of years of quiet dedication. She knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she had the courage, the talent, and the passion to see it through. As she left the hall that night, the applause and wisp